A man sits alone in his dimly lit room. His weathered hands grip a revolver, 1 bullet, 6 chambers. His finger tightens on the trigger. Empty. God has spoken. He will live to kill again. It all started with a simple visit to church. Pardo was not your ordinary churchgoer. Beneath his quiet exterior lay the soul of a man haunted by his past. Every Sunday he would kneel before the altar seeking forgiveness for sins that painted his dreams red with blood. But on this particular morning something was different. Pardo watched as 4 men surrounded the panicked stranger. These were not ordinary fishermen. What followed was a baptism of brutality. They held Augustine's head beneath the dark harbor water until his lungs screamed for air. Then they would pull him up just long enough to repeat their demands before plunging him back into the depths. Over and over. Each submersion bringing him closer to unconsciousness, closer to death. When the 4 men finally grew tired of their game, they left Augustine bleeding and gasping on the wet dock. That's when Pardo made his choice. "Take me to Antonia's house," Augustine whispered through cracked lips. "She will know what to do." When Antonia opened the door and saw Augustine's condition, her face told a story of recognition and fear. This was not the first time violence had followed someone to her doorstep. Without hesitation, she ushered them inside, then immediately sent her young son away to stay with relatives. The boy was sick, desperately sick, the kind of illness that required surgery and medicine that cost more money than people like Antonia could ever hope to possess. As Antonia tended to Augustine's wounds, Pardo found himself studying this woman. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she cleaned cuts and applied bandages. This was not her first time treating victims of violence. While Augustine rested, Pardo questioned him about the bag he had hidden in the church. Why that location? Who was he hiding it from? But Augustine's answers only revealed how little he understood about the forces now hunting him. All he wanted was for the violence to end. That night, Pardo returned to his small apartment. From a drawer, he retrieved the revolver that had become both his compass and his judge. 1 bullet, 5 empty chambers. The mathematics of divine judgment. This was how Pardo determined God's will. If the hammer fell on an empty chamber, he would live to continue his work. Pardo called it prayer. He pressed the cold metal against his temple and pulled the trigger. God still had work for him to do. By morning, Pardo had made his decision. The 4 men who had tortured Augustine represented everything wrong with the world. Pardo approached the 4 men with calm confidence. They recognized him as the stranger who had been asking questions about their business. What they did not recognize was the danger walking straight toward them. He had come to deliver judgment. The 4th man's death was the most dramatic. In his panic, he stumbled backward toward a boat whose engine was still running. The spinning propeller caught him at head level, and the result was both instant and horrifying. When the killing was finished, Pardo methodically searched the bodies. Whatever money and valuables these men had carried now served a higher purpose. Everything went into a bag that would later find its way to the church's collection box. Walking away from the scene, Pardo felt no satisfaction. No joy in the lives he had taken. As Pardo made his way through the city streets toward Antonia's house, he noticed signs of increased activity. The missing money had attracted attention from people far more dangerous than the 4 dead men at the harbor. When Pardo reached Antonia's house, he found Augustine pacing nervously by the windows. The man's fear was almost tangible as he pointed toward the street, where armed figures could be seen moving with military precision. "That bag I hid in the church," Augustine whispered. "It belongs to people who kill without thinking twice. Drug dealers, cartel money. I thought I could just take enough to help Antonia's son, but now they're going to kill all of us." Pardo made Augustine an offer. He would protect him from the cartel's hunters, but only if the money was returned to its rightful owners. But even as Augustine agreed to the terms, Pardo knew the situation was far more complicated than a simple theft. The men hunting them were not interested in justice or fair deals. They were interested in sending a message written in blood and terror. To keep Augustine and Antonia safe, Pardo made the decision to move them away from the city. Using his car, he transported them to a cave system along a deserted stretch of coastline. The caves had been carved by centuries of waves and wind, creating natural hiding places that few people knew existed. Hidden within the stone chambers, Augustine and Antonia would be safe while Pardo negotiated with their hunters. At least that was the plan. But plans have a way of unraveling when they encounter the harsh reality of criminal violence. Pardo's offer was simple. He knew where the missing money was hidden. In exchange for this information, the cartel would take their money and leave the city permanently. Under armed escort, Pardo led Pedro and his men to the church where Augustin had supposedly hidden the bag. But after hours of systematic searching, they found nothing. The bag was not there. It had never been there. And Piedra's patience was about to run out in the most violent way possible. His orders were simple and final. Kill the man who had lied to them. But Pardo had not survived this long by being unprepared. The fight that erupted in the sacred space was both brutal and brief. All died quickly and without mercy. When Pedro returned to find his men dead, he knew he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than a simple thief. This was a professional, but a killer who had turned his own trap against him. Racing back to his headquarters, Pedro made an urgent call to his superior, Steve Braddock, the real owner of the missing money and a figure whose reputation for cruelty was legendary even among career criminals. The Braddock listened to Piedra's report with growing anger. Not only was the money still missing, but now they had a body count that would attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. The situation had moved beyond simple recovery into the realm of warfare. But there was something else troubling about Piedra's description of the killer. Pardo was returning to the cave where he had left Augustin and Antonia. Inside the rocky chamber, Augustin and Antonia were busy counting stacks of money. The very money that Piedra's men had failed to find in the church. Her eyes held a mixture of hope and defiance that spoke of a mother's determination to save her child regardless of the cost. This money could pay for her son's surgery. But Pardo had made a promise to return the money to its owners. And Pardo's entire identity was built on being a man who kept his word regardless of the personal cost. Antonia tried to stop him. She begged and pleaded, explaining about her son's condition and the surgery he desperately needed. But Pardo's face remained stone. He had made his choice and nothing would change it. The drive back toward the city was one of the longest of Pardo's life. Behind him, he was leaving a woman whose son would die because of his decision. Ahead of him waited criminals who would use the returned money to cause more suffering. Halfway to his destination, Pardo stopped the car. Sitting alone on a dark road, he found himself thinking about his own past, about choices he had made and prices he had paid, about the difference between justice and cruelty. His wife's face appeared in his memory. Not as she had died, but as she had lived, full of compassion and understanding. She would not have approved of letting a child die to satisfy a criminal's demand for their stolen property. When Pardo returned to the cave and gave the money back to Antonia and Augustin, he said nothing about his change of heart. Instead, he simply performed his nightly ritual with the revolver, 1 bullet. 5 empty chambers. The hammer fell on emptiness once again. The god apparently approved of mercy over rigid justice. But returning the money to Antonia meant that Pardo's problems with the cartel were far from over. Over the following days, Pardo began a systematic campaign against the drug operation. He studied their movements and identified their key locations. He learned their schedules and discovered their weaknesses. And then he began to destroy everything they had built. A shipment intercepted here. A safe house raided there. But each strike was precise and devastating. Wounded and exhausted, Pardo made his way back to the cave where Augustin and Antonia waited. That night, as Pardo rested and tried to ignore the pain from his various injuries, Antonia approached him. Her presence was gentle and comforting in a way he had not experienced since his wife's death. When she touched his back, trying to ease the tension in his muscles, Pardo was transported back to happier times. But those memories also brought darker recollections. Images of his pregnant wife being tortured by a man whose cruelty knew no boundaries. A man named Alacrin, whose nickname of Scorpion perfectly captured his venomous nature. The memory was as vivid as if it were happening again. Pardo, bound and helpless as Alacrin used knives to open his wife's pregnant belly. The screams, the blood, the impossible choice between ending her suffering quickly or watching it continue indefinitely. In the end, Pardo had pulled the trigger that ended his wife's life. Not from cruelty, but from love. The mercy of a quick death instead of prolonged torture. But mercy or not, he had still killed the woman he loved and the unborn child she carried. That trauma had created the Redeemer, a man who tried to balance the scales of justice by killing those who deserved death. Outside the cave, the real world was closing in with deadly intent. While Pardo had been fighting his way through cartel soldiers in the city, Augustin had decided to make his own escape. His boat was moored at a small harbor not far from their hiding place. When Augustin made his desperate swim toward freedom, he was spotted immediately. The poor man never reached his boat. The trap was set. Meanwhile, Pardo had decided that hiding was no longer an option. It was time to end things permanently by striking at the heart of their operation. Armed with weapons taken from his previous battles, Pardo approached the drug factory that served as the cartel's main production facility. The Pardo moved like an avenging angel, bringing death to those who poisoned communities with their products. The final confrontation came in the factory owner's office on the building's top floor. Pardo climbed the stairs expecting to find Steve Braddock waiting with his most trusted bodyguards. Instead, he found an empty room with bullet holes in the walls and blood stains on the expensive carpet. As Pardo examined the room more closely, he noticed a figure sitting motionless in a large chair behind the desk. The man was dead, had been dead for some time based on the condition of the body. As consciousness fled his body, he caught a glimpse of the man who had been waiting in the shadows. Alacrin had finally found him. When Pardo awoke, he found himself in a place that held terrible significance. The beach in front of the church where his story had begun. The first part of Alacrin's revenge involved forcing Augustin to choose between his own life and a quick death. A gun was placed in the terrified man's hands with instructions to shoot himself in the head. The same impossible choice that Pardo had faced with his pregnant wife years earlier. When Antonia screamed in horror at this demand, Alacrin shot her in the leg. The wound was painful but not fatal. For a moment it seemed as if Augustin might actually pull the trigger. But at the last second his survival instinct overcame his fear, and he tried to turn the weapon toward Alacrin instead. The attempt failed. Alacrin was too experienced and too prepared for such desperate moves. The gun that had killed Augustin was placed in her trembling hands. She was ordered to end her own life or watch as Alacrin made her death much slower and more painful. But as Antonia raised the weapon, she suddenly spun the gun toward him. Justice demanded that this man who had caused so much suffering should pay with his life. But instead of delivering the killing blow, Pardo made a choice that surprised even himself. He stepped back and allowed Alacrin to live. The man who had every reason to kill him was instead offering something completely unexpected: forgiveness and a chance at redemption. The Pardo spoke quietly about the cycle of violence that had consumed both their lives. It was an offer of redemption extended from one broken man to another. Not because Alacrin deserved mercy, but because the alternative was simply more death and more suffering in an endless cycle that would consume everyone it touched. If you've made it this far without smashing that subscribe button, congrats. You officially have more self-control than I do at a buffet. But seriously, hit subscribe. I waste my life watching movies so you don't have to. It's the least you could do.